Good morning, class. I see you've got a couple people in already. How's everybody doing? If you are able to comment, free to comment. I'd like some more discussion today. So as people log on, if you have a channel and you're able to comment, please feel free to do so. If not, that's fine. You could always, one way we can adapt is you can shoot an email over to my email, and I will check that, give a comment. We're going to give it another minute or so before we get into the content today, but today's lesson is going to be on the civil rights movement. And the whole chapter is on the civil rights movement, but we're getting into the early civil rights movement today. So we're going to give it about another minute-ish before we roll into the content, just to give everyone a chance that wants to log on to log on. I hope everybody had a good weekend. So after this week, it's going to be spring break, so I bet people are excited about that. Yeah, give it about 20 more seconds. If you hear any noise in the background, that would be my children playing. About 5 seconds. Hey, good morning, Audrey. Good to see you on here. All right, we're going to roll on into it now. So we're talking today about the early civil rights movement. So the book starts out by kind of like giving a little intro with Rosa Parks, then it walks it back to 1909, and then it walks it forward from there. So we're going to start where the book starts, where in 1955, in December of 1955, Rosa Parks is getting on a bus. And buses in the South, because of the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which the Supreme Court decided in 1896, when Rosa Parks got on the bus, they had a white section in the front, they had a black section in the back of the bus where African Americans had to sit. And then they had like a middle section where if there were no whites sitting there, then African Americans could sit in the middle section. But the law was, or the regulations were, that if a white person came and needed to sit in the middle, then anyone who was black had to get up and give their seat to the white person. And looking back on this, I think we're just kind of like appalled, and we should be. We're appalled by this, where this is actual law. And Rosa Parks is sitting, and the bus starts to fill up, and a white man's like, "Hey, give me your seat," and she refuses. And because she refuses, that man who wanted her seat tells the bus driver. The bus driver's like, "Okay, fine, we're just going to call the police." So the bus driver calls the police. The police come and they arrest Rosa Parks for not giving her seat up to a white man. All right, so you have an African American woman who is arrested, and there are charges placed against her for not giving her seat up to a white man. Now, where this is going to get us back to where the civil rights legal fight is going to start in earnest in the early 1900s, like even as early as 1909, is when Rosa Parks is arrested in 1955. A legal group called the NAACP steps up, and they're going to challenge Rosa Parks's arrest and the charges against Rosa Parks. So we're going to use the NAACP intervening as kind of a springboard to get into early civil rights movement in America. All right, any questions up to this point? Any comments? Okay. All right, so before this had happened, so before December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks is arrested for not giving up her seat to a white man, the NAACP had been pushing for legal gains. They were trying to challenge laws that were racist laws that were on the books. Since 1909, they started legal challenges. Now, this points out a few things. The first thing I always point out when I teach this is that just because something is legal doesn't mean that it's morally right. Right? Segregation was legal, and mistreatment of African Americans was legal, but that doesn't mean it was morally right. So that's just something to think of when we're considering laws, is that just because something's a law doesn't mean it's a good law or a morally upright law. So these laws existed that oppressed African Americans, but they were immoral laws, unethical laws. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to use this logic to say that not only should we not comply with unjust or immoral laws, but we have a duty to not comply with them. It's not that we just shouldn't comply, that we're duty bound to not comply would be his logic, and I think he makes a very convincing argument. All right, so back to the NAACP. So the NAACP since 1909 had been challenging oppression of African Americans, and they had been bringing challenges to the court for quite a while. One of their big cases where they got a lot of gains legally was Norris versus Alabama. So in 1935, in Norris versus Alabama, uh, the courts ruled that African Americans were allowed to serve on juries. So pre 1935, African Americans were actually not allowed to serve on juries. Uh, so this is where we see a major gain where African Americans are given access to what would be considered a legal responsibility or a civic duty. So that's a big victory of the NAACP pre Rosa Parks. So with that victory, we're going to see they're going to be emboldened to push for more and more bigger and bigger victories. All right, we're going to pause. Any comments? Any questions? Okay. So now let's talk about CORE. So a civil rights group called CORE was established, and it was established in 1942, and it is the Congress of Racial Equality. And one of their big strategies was something that they had taken from union workers. I don't know if you hear that sound. I'm flipping my page here on my notes. Um, CORE took a page out of the playbook of unions, and they're going to start encouraging sit-in protests. So a sit-in protest is very simply where you sit in somewhere where either you're not supposed to be, as far as the law is concerned, or you sit in somewhere and disrupt normal activities to protest. And these sit-in protests we're going to talk about tomorrow are actually very effective. So we have the NAACP and we have CORE, and these two groups, among others, are pushing really hard for equality. Another very big case, I would say probably the one of the biggest landmark cases in the civil rights movement, is Brown versus the Board of Education. So there's a little girl, and she wants to go to a school that is very close to her, but it's a whites only school. I mean, we're very close, a few hundred yards walk away. But because of segregation laws, she has to go to a blacks only school, which is a several miles walk one way away from where she lives. And she sues, and because of the court ruling, the court rules, and it's a great ruling, the court rules that separate but equal isn't equal. It's just separate. So it challenges the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling in 1896 and says that just because Linda Brown has access to a school, it's not equal. Therefore, schools need to be desegregated. So it overturns the idea of segregation in schools, but there's a lot of resistance in the South because just because the law changes doesn't mean the hearts change. And so a lot of people in the South are very resistant to desegregating or to integrating schools. And while this resistance to integration is going on, we see Rosa Parks' decision occurring. I'm going to pause real quick for questions or comments. Okay, so Rosa Parks, Brown versus Board of Education is in 1954. Rosa Parks is arrested in 1955, and in 1956, in response to Rosa Parks being arrested, the Supreme Court rules that segregation of buses is illegal. So this completely overturns the idea in Plessy versus Ferguson, because Plessy versus Ferguson was a public transportation issue. It was a train, and it was in 1896 the ruling was given that separate but equal was okay. Now the Supreme Court in 1956 rules separate but equal on public transportation is not okay, that's illegal. But that doesn't mean that busing companies in the South are going to desegregate. So we're going to see that just because the law changes doesn't mean people are going to comply. And one of the big things that occurred during the wait between the ruling of the Supreme Court in Rosa Parks' case and Rosa Parks being arrested is the Montgomery bus boycotts, which are led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And they last for almost a year, and they economically hurt the busing companies because busing companies were relying on income from passengers, some of whom were African American, and when the income from African Americans stops, that hurts them economically, but then the courts also force them to desegregate. Okay, one other major thing that's a symbolic victory, but it doesn't have a lot of legal significance. It has a little bit, but it's not as big of a deal as we're going to see in the 60s. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 is passed, and it does a few things. So we're going to see gains, right? So 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. 1955, Montgomery bus boycotts. 1956, the Supreme Court rules that busing segregation is illegal. 1957, Civil Rights Act passes, but it doesn't have a lot of legal teeth. It's not very strong legally. It does a couple of things. One is it tries to protect the rights of African Americans to vote. It doesn't really do a whole lot in that department, not nearly as much as the Civil Rights Act of 1965 is going to do. The other thing that it does is it creates a civil rights division in the Department of Justice. And this is a big step, but it's only more of a symbolic step than anything else. So what I want you to see today is because of court challenges and because the NAACP and other groups are willing to push, we see slowly gains in rights of African Americans over time. So we see 1935, African Americans can serve on a jury. 1954, schools are supposed to desegregate. They don't, but they're supposed to. And then 1956, buses are supposed to desegregate. They don't, but they're supposed to. 1957, Civil Rights Act. So there are slow gains that are occurring in the civil rights movement, but it's going to take a lot more to push America in the direction that it needs to go. All right, that's the main portion of the lesson today. Any questions, comments, any reflections? All right, well, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, feel free to email me. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great day. See you guys.